this is Ben Schwell, and today I'm talking to you about the Germanic languages. Which one should you learn? Hey, hit that subscribe button, it really helps the channel. Thanks. In this video, I'm talking about Swedish, Norwegian, Danish. If you want to learn more about the West Germanic languages and reasons to learn them, check out the video I just did before this one, which covers German, Dutch, and Afrikaans. And because Icelandic is so different from these three, I'm doing another video on Icelandic, which I'll put here or here. I don't know which, somewhere here. There is a clear dividing line here between the West Germanic languages and the North Germanic languages. Hey, what about the East Germanic languages? They got wiped out, so we're just looking at these two. And the West Germanic languages are much more closer to each other, a lot in terms of vocabulary, though North and West Germanic are going to share a lot, and often you'll be able to figure out bits between them with knowledge of either branch's languages. But the North branch was together up well past 1000 AD, which wasn't true going further south and west. So Norwegian, Swedish, Danish, Icelandic, less so, but these four languages were much more closely integrated culturally over a much longer period of time, and they share traits which are very distinct to each other, which are not shared by West Germanic languages. Just to be aware of that. And that's partially why I'm dividing these two into two different videos for you. Actually, I'm doing 3 videos on these Germanic languages. The next one's going to be Icelandic. I decided to just do it all on its own because there's so much that's unique about the Icelandic language. It's worth showing you on its own in its own video. And because these 3, Danish, Swedish, Norwegian, are so close together, it's worth just concentrating on those for you here and now. Danish, Norwegian, and Swedish. There's no way around it, you have to discuss them together. So the grammar bit for these, just to show you what's a bit unique, I'll discuss them all at once after I go through each of these. So you can see what's unique about them culturally and their legacy, and then see how similar they are in the terms of just a quick glimpse at grammar. People often say, well, which one should you learn first? In terms of learning a Scandinavian language from an English-speaking point of view, I assume that means people want to learn more than one. If that's your goal, then start with Norwegian. And here's why. The Norwegian people have been ruled both by Denmark and Sweden at different points in their history, and this left imprints upon their culture, identity, and language. They can read the Danish language quite easily, and they can understand the Swedish language quite easily. So if you get Norwegian, you have a gateway into these other languages. Languages are gateways. Some Norwegian dialects are a bit close to some North English dialects, and there are quite a few words that have gone between the two languages, a bit more so than with Danish or Swedish. So definitely, if you want to learn more than one, start with Norwegian. It also has something quite beautiful in terms of medieval poetry called skaldic poetry. I don't have time to go into that, but it's a deep tradition and it's worth reading and learning about. In terms of the identity and what you're going to get into, there are 2 main variations of Norwegian. Bokmål, which you'll contact first and get into first more than likely, and Nynorsk, which it's another variation. So when Norway won its independence, or chose to become independent in 1905, it had gone through a long period of romanticism, of romantic nostalgia looking toward the great Viking past. And this has left a deep imprint upon their culture today, from poetry, painting, to the playwrights like Henrik Ibsen. Their culture is littered in references to the Viking Age and independence. Independence and self-sustainability is everything. So that's why in terms of the European Union, they're a bit half-arm apart compared to Sweden or Denmark. They want their independence. And there's a bit of a coldness there, but that's their culture, and there's historical reason why. They were governed by two other powers, and they don't want people to really tell them what to do. And whilst it's easier to learn Norwegian and then learn other languages, there's a drawback and a catch to that. It's more difficult to understand different dialects of Norwegian. So you get easier access to Swedish and Danish, but there are variations within Norwegian that are much more difficult, and that's because of the landscape. This is an incredibly mountainous country, the land of the fjords. And so you would have to spend time in each of these local areas to fully even understand different dialects of the Norwegian language. If you're interested as well in how to connect country with infrastructure, technological advancements of communication in terms of water, getting resources to different towns, train links, and how to really connect a country that is impossible to connect. Norway has done it. Norway is a brilliant success in bringing their communities together despite geography being in the way. And it's the geography that has created the differences in language within the Norwegian language. Norway is a small country, but it has some influence overseas. It has some smaller islands like Svalbard, which it does own, and it's gone on Arctic expeditions. It's world renowned for skiing and Winter Olympics. If you like the cold, Norway is definitely for you. The second most difficult of these Scandinavian languages, I would say, would be Swedish. Now, Danish would be a bit easier to read in many cases, but Swedish would be easier to speak. And I'll get to that in a bit with Danish. Swedish also has its history, its own empire that it had, the Kingdom of Sweden, which was quite large at some point. This was a colonial power, controlling basically the Baltic Sea at one point and extending its power out into the world. This was an age of exploration, a military power, innovating new laws and ideas of democracy. If you're interested in the mercantile era and the age of developing parliaments, this is a really interesting culture to learn about. And it also has economic prowess. You can, in Sweden, become a wealthy businessman. You can develop industry and financial capabilities with your business. It's worth learning for that. It's worth noting that Germany and Iceland, of the languages that I'm mentioning, and Afrikaans, are the only two republics that are not monarchies, and that has an identity there. All these Scandinavian languages are governed by monarchies, and that does give them a sense of an aristocratic flair in a way. Not so much in Norway, but definitely in Sweden. Sweden is very proud of its aristocratic past. It hasn't really had a revolution in the same way that Denmark had in 1848, or an independence victory like Norway had. Well, twice it was liberated from the Nazis as well. So Sweden was, of these Scandinavian languages, the more imperial power, the one with a longer history without physically overthrowing its government. And that is a sense of cultural conservatism that is existent in Sweden today, despite its social liberalism and social democratic institutions, which is very at the forefront of giving people rights. One feature of Swedish that makes it so unique is this country has been neutral for a long time. They weren't in the world wars, and so they've had the time to have this cultural stasis and develop themselves and innovate their culture. IKEA, Pippi Longstockings, she's Swedish. Sweden has not been destroyed recently by war, is what I'm saying. Like Norway, you do have this romantic era of harking back to kind of a golden age, but it's quite different from Norway's case, because later in history, after the Viking Age, you had this Kingdom of Sweden, which was quite large. So nostalgia took a different form, and it influenced their culture. They have a lot of loanwords from the lands that they ruled over, like Finland. Finland speaks Finnish and Swedish. So Swedish is not just in Sweden, and the Swedish language has changed in some ways to accommodate that. There are a lot of loanwords in Swedish from Finnish, which changes the makeup and even the flavor of Swedish to a degree, which is not quite seen in other Germanic languages. So that makes Swedish a bit special. If you are thinking of learning Finnish or Estonian after learning a Germanic language, then Swedish is definitely the one you should choose. The last language I would choose to learn if I was choosing a random Scandinavian language as an English speaker would be Danish. But it has lots going for it in its own right as to why you should choose it. It is going to be much more difficult for you to learn as a speaker to ever speak it as a native, just because of all the mumbling sounds, that happen in Danish, and how subtle they speak certain syllables, and frankly how guttural a lot of their sounds are. I've spoken to Danish people and they've said that you can't ever really sound like a native Danish speaker unless you were speaking it by 7 or 8 years old. I don't know how true that is, but just the thought that people have said it to me means this is a language that is not going to come easy spoken. Reading a language is completely different, but Danish is going to be very much more difficult to learn to speak. Danish also has a higher propensity of words loaned from German, which is a bit different from Swedish or Norwegian. All of these three do, but Danish is a bit more. One peculiar feature of the Danish language is in some of their numbers they count like the French do. In contrast to Swedish and Norwegian, Denmark was a colonial power that had a revolution, a miniature revolution in 1848. So they have had the experience of physically removing their government. And when you have, as a people, risen up and physically removed your government in the last 200 years, that changes your mentality. It gives you a lot of confidence about yourself as a people. You don't restrict people's civil liberties. They are very proud of their rights. But because they're a monarchy, and that monarchy survived 1848, they have this sense of imperial prestige as well. This pompousness, which is quite nice in a way, frankly. And they ruled over the Faroes, Iceland, and Greenland, so they had kind of a small empire going on, and they projected their power outward. They were an expansive people, and so they're going to have quite a few words from this maritime empire experience in their culture that is not going to quite have the same roots as, say, Swedish or Norwegian. Denmark is a small country which had an empire. At one point, a long time ago, they ruled over most of England. And they punch above their weight on the world stage. This is a highly bicycle-friendly country, as is the Netherlands, and it's a highly homogeneous country, which gives it a social cohesiveness. One thing that I find unique about Denmark is its cuisine. It's got this thick, hearty bread that you get in Norway and Sweden to a degree, and the fishing heritage. But you also, because it's further south, get garden foods. Almost like the river valleys of Europe influenced the southern bit of Denmark, and the Scandinavian cold, hearty bit influenced the northern bit of Denmark, and the two fused. Hearty bread with fish, and then you get garden vegetables, and it's this wonderful fusion of cuisine I think is really special about Denmark, and it's worth learning, frankly. The language, Danish, just because the food is so exceptionally good, in my opinion. Danish food is lovely. So let's look at these three in terms of how similar they are, just from a grammatical point of view, with some slight differences, and they are on a spectrum here. Danish is more infamous for swallowing letters and not actually pronouncing them. Danish will often use ND and LD at the ends of words, as opposed to double L and double N. which you'll get more in Norwegian and more especially in Swedish. Let me show you what I mean. He knows her. Don't quote my pronunciation on this. This is the best I can, right? In Danish, han kjenner henne. And you swallow that D. You barely hear it, if at all. In Norwegian, han kjenner henne. And in Swedish, han kjenner henne. The pronunciation is really different between them, but the languages are really similar. You get things that Danish or Norwegian will use in terms of spelling, like the double K, but Swedish will spell it CK. Danish and Norwegian shared a lot more for a lot longer in terms of the Denmark people ruled over Norway quite a bit, and it was the prestige language. Danish and German were the official languages of Norway for a long time, not Norwegian. And so you get spelling similarities in some senses, like this AE thing here, both used in Danish or Norwegian, but not Swedish. And this cool O, I just think that line through it looks cool. You get that in Danish and Norwegian, but Swedish use this A and the O with the little umlaut at the top. And all three of these languages use this letter A with the circle above it, and that's unique to all of them. So there's a lot of cultural contact going between them and some things that are unique about each of them in terms of how they spell and use their alphabet. In other cases, they have really similar words that are pronounced in different ways that would throw you off if you weren't having knowledge of how these things are pronounced. Take noun genders. In Danish, there are two genders, common and neuter. Some minor dialects you have kind of a feminine gender in some senses, but these are very limited. So mainly they have two genders. But in Norwegian there are three genders, masculine, feminine, and neuter. And in Swedish there are two genders, but in some smaller dialects you do get a third feminine gender, but that's very limited. What makes Swedish in this terms of grammatical complexity a bit more difficult is in terms of the pronouns, like I, he, you, she, etc. There are some remnants of a case system, which makes it a bit different to Danish and Norwegian, and a bit more complex in some subtle ways, but you're not really going to notice it. It's just there in the background. Let's look at some sentences just in brief to show you how different these languages are and how similar. Hold the feather up to the light. Don't quote my pronunciation again. So in Danish, hold fjeren up mot lyset. And that en at the end of feather and that et, that's the word the. So in all three of these languages, you can see through them, there's that en and et at the ending. That's the word the. These languages attach the article to the end of the noun rather than having it separate like you would have in German, Dutch, or English. But notice that's slightly different in Swedish. Some of the endings in Swedish, fjädern, it's quite different. Also, you have this LD ending. It's slightly pronounced for hold in Danish. It's not pronounced, that D, in Norwegian. And in Swedish, you don't even spell it that way. And there's that D at the end of mod. The Danish language is a bit more subtle in terms of how hard its consonants are. They're not as pronounced as you get further north. Next one. My feathers are in a crown. Danish, min fjerde er en krone. Norwegian, fjerdene mine er en krone. Swedish, mine fjädrar är en krone. So what you get is Danish swallowing those vowels in the eri end, and it's much more, well, it's not as easy to discern which sounds are which. It's more subtle in how it shows sound. And then Norwegian has this word for my, mina, comes after the verb, so that's a bit unique. And the word for feathers, they show plural in three different ways here. In Swedish you have that AR ending, in Norwegian you have the E ending, and in Danish they really cut down the word entirely. Sometimes even simple verbs can be completely different, so you need to be aware of that. Take a look at this sentence to know what I mean. Do you like your prince? In Danish, kan du lide din prins? But in Norwegian, liker du prinsen din? And in Swedish, gillar du din prins? And you'll notice the pronouns for you and your are in different places in all three of these languages here. In Swedish, they put them side by side, like you, your prince. But in Norwegian, they're on both sides of that object. And yet in Danish, there's a longer construct to express that you like something entirely. So these are different languages, but they're very similar, so they share a lot of cognates, words which are spelled identically and are the same in many cases, but in some cases you have the same word and it's completely different. Like flink. In Danish it means nice, but in Norwegian it means skilled or clever, and in Swedish it means nimble. These languages are really similar grammatically, but they each have something unique and special about them. From an English-speaking perspective, they enrich my English, just learning small bits about them, because you can see how English is related to them. So any of these languages, if you are an English speaker, it's going to make your English a bit more poignant in how you choose words. Hey, don't forget the next video, the Icelandic video that I'm making next time, so that you can conclude this 3-part series on the Germanic languages. Hey, thank you very much for watching. We'll see you in the next episode next time.